Excellent. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our inaugural Global Public Seminar in Comparative and International Education. These are joint seminars organized by the Department of Education and St. Edmund Hall at the University of Oxford. My name is Maia Chankseliani, for those who do not know me. I am Associate Professor of Comparative and International Education at Oxford. I'm course leader of MSc in Comparative and International Education and also the convener of the Comparative and International Education Research Group. Before introducing our seminar series in greater detail and our speaker, there are some brief administrative points to mention, if you do not mind. So this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be posted online in due course. We will only record the first half of the webinar, including the presentation. We will not be recording the Q&A due to the GDPR regulations. Therefore, can I ask everyone to please keep your cameras off until after the presentation. So when we start the Q&A, everyone can, if you wish, turn on your cameras. That part will not be recorded. Please keep yourself muted throughout the webinar unless you have been asked to speak or ask a question. In order to ask a question, and we hope we will have a lively discussion in the second half of the webinar, in order to ask a question, use the chat function and write out the question that you wish to ask. At the end of the presentation, if your question is selected, you will be invited to ask it yourself directly. When invited to ask a question, please unmute yourself, switch on your video, and state your name and where you are from. Now let me tell you a few words about our global public seminars in comparative and international education that we are commencing today. These seminars, will address themes of major interest to academics, to practitioners, policymakers, and the broader public working in education field or just interested in education, based anywhere in the world. These webinars will be open to all who are interested in participating. And they will aim to illuminate the role of education in societal development. We will be analyzing changes in education policy, discourse, and practice. We will be discussing how changes influence individual opportunities and shape the development of educational institutions in different parts of the world. These seminars will zoom into the local and zoom out into the national and supranational spaces, flows, and influences on education. We have a series of 6 webinars planned for this summer. In the next few moments, I will share a link in the chat to the webpage where you can read about the forthcoming webinars and book your place. Now the best part comes, introducing our speaker. Our speaker today is Professor Thabo Msibi. I am delighted to warmly welcome Thabo, a good old friend of mine. We did our PhDs together at the University of Cambridge, long time ago now. I must tell you that he was a brilliant role model for everyone. Now he's Associate Professor in Curriculum Studies in the School of Education at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, where he's also the Dean and Head of the School of Education. Thabo Msibi's scholarship revolves around the issues of gender and sexuality, particularly as they relate to education. He has written on homophobia, on teacher identities, teacher professionalism. He's also interested in theory building around African sexualities more broadly. Recently, he has published a monograph titled Hidden Sexualities of South African Teachers, Black Male Educators, and Same-Sex Desire. He is widely published, and I would encourage you to look at his publications following the talk. Thabo's talk today will focus on breaking gender, sex, and sexuality borders. He will be presenting the case of comprehensive sexuality education in South Africa. I will now pass it over to Thabo Msibi. The floor is yours.
Well, a very good afternoon, and thank you so much for that warm welcome, Maya. I'm very grateful to be engaging colleagues at Oxford today, and I want to thank you very much for inviting me on these very exciting conversations that you're having around comparative and international education. I'm very excited, of course, to be with you this afternoon. As Maya has indicated, I am going to be focusing a lot this afternoon on issues of gender, sex, of race, sexuality, but in the context of the comprehensive sexuality education policy that has been recently introduced in South Africa. Of course, when I say recently, I want to just note that comprehensive sexuality in South Africa has been around for quite some time. It's the revised framework from UNESCO that has been reintroduced in the public space, but I'll speak more around it. You'll excuse me because I will be engaging with the document that is in front of me, but there will be the slide that is going to be in front of you. So do excuse me if I do not look up too often. Just please follow through and let me know if I'm going too fast. Also, I do want to note that I have an office that is environmentally friendly. So at some point during this conversation, I'm certain that the lights will go off. Please do not be scared. Nothing is happening. It's just because the lights automatically go off if I do not move for a particular, a long period of time. So please take note of that. Again, thank you very much, Maya, for this very generous and kind invitation. I begin my work by noting the first study that did a nationally representative engagement on sexual victimization of children in 2016, which came from the Optimus Foundation. The study involved around 4,086 children that were recruited in schools nationally, as well as about 5,631 participants that were recruited from South African households. Unsurprisingly, yet of course quite sobering, the study found that 35.4%, that is 1 in every 3 young people in South Africa, had experienced some form of sexual abuse at some point in their lives. Also, the household study found, consistent with the schooling study, that 26.3% of children in South African households had actually experienced some form of sexual abuse. This data was also again consistent with data from the Minister of Education in 2019, when she decried the increase in pregnancies amongst girls aged 10 to 17 in South Africa, noting that more than 120,000 learners had fallen pregnant in the preceding year, and that many of these children fell pregnant as a result of unequal power relations, of poverty, of unconsensual sex, and of sexual coercion. While many of these challenges that I am engaging with today can be characterized as global, it is not in question that they pose serious challenges for quality education, for social and economic development, and freedom of young people, especially girls, in the context of South Africa and, of course, globally. It is against this backdrop that the South African government sought to align itself with a global movement on comprehensive sexual education, an international education policy and social framework that has gained much attention following the adoption and the promulgation of the International Technical Guidance on Sexual Education by UNESCO in 2009, and the subsequent revision that occurred to the same guidelines in 2018. In this presentation, I undertake a comparative analysis on the recent attempt by the Minister of Basic Education to introduce scripted comprehensive sexuality education lessons in South Africa that were aligned to the UNESCO guidelines. Rather than locating the comparative dimension of analysis across multiple nations, I, like Linda Chisholm and Gita Samahansi, who are very well-known comparative educational scholars, seek to locate and explore the dialectic engagement between the international policy environment and the local experience. I attempt to explore, in some granular methodological approach, the various ways in which policy travels transnationally and gets reappropriated, reconfigured, and reimagined at a local level. I focus less on comparison and more on the dialectic, as I'm fully cognizant that there are limitations in approaches that either compare bounded units that are not changed by the interaction, or that examine the impacts of more general whole without examining the mutual connectedness. And I'm quoting Linda Chisholm here. Through analyzing the national pushback to comprehensive sexuality education, I suggest, like Dennis Altman, that the international policy landscape on sexuality has been characterized at most by a transnational borrowing of American logic and ideas, which are often presented in a discourse of normalcy and universalism at a local level. I will attempt to show that while such discourses have resulted in many advances in the improvement of human experience, they also have enabled the adoption of similar strategies and techniques by conservative forces who are determined to undo the gains by capitalizing in the universalizing force of transnational policy borrowing. In order to advance the arguments of this paper more meaningfully, it will be important to interrogate the history of education in South Africa with the aim of mapping the terrain of curriculum development in the country, particularly in relation to the progressive disposition that has been taken up by the post-apartheid South African government. As Crane Sudin and Linda Chisholm have noted, curriculum debates in South Africa have largely centered on dealing with the exclusionary legacy of apartheid and the preparation of young people for a life in a complex and new world order. Therefore, to understand the present day experience and enactment of policy in South Africa, I suggest we need to visit history and to unpack what informs day-to-day educational experience, the system, including the very progressive position of the post-apartheid state in relation to policy making and curriculum design. Through this process, I locate curriculum experience within Pina's definition of career, which is a complicated conversation where experience is centered in the regressive, the progressive, the analytical, and the synthetical processes of reflection and narration. So, what was education like in South Africa prior to colonialism? I argue that prior to colonialism, education in South Africa largely took part in a place where part of the process was socializing young people to grow up in that particular society. The socialization processes were undertaken through cultural means and practices. The purpose of education was to facilitate the transfer of cultural and traditional knowledge from community elders to the young, with the aim of ensuring the development of a whole individual who would be acquainted with the social and political expectations within the society, including the gender and sexual norms of the society. Sexuality education, it can be argued, form part of this knowledge transfer process through cultural rites of passage processes that included mentorship from elders. The aim of this introductory comment is not so much to glorify pre-colonial education, but rather it is to dispel any mythical idea of a colonial Africa or colonial South Africa that was devoid of any form of education or sexuality education for that matter. Contrary to the views that were espoused by Cecil John Rhodes, who was once a student actually at this prestigious institution, Oxford, Africa wasn't just lying there and ready for European powers. There existed complicated systems and structures of education, governance, politics, and social life that ensured human existence and, to a large degree, human success. The arrival of colonizers in South Africa marked the advent of schooling. For the colonial project to be successful, local people had to believe that local beliefs, cultures, practices, and actions were barbaric and backward, and that they needed to be rescued from this uncivility. At this stage, you may be wondering why this is so important. You'll see the links as I proceed through this engagement. Therefore, missionary education became instrumental in the government's purpose of modeling this desire. Black education in colonial South Africa was left in the hands of missionaries who were not only there to evangelize, but also to ensure the importation of European ideals of exclusivity and superiority in African life. Before the ascension of the South African nationalists in 1948, 97%, right, of schools, Black schools in South Africa were controlled by missionaries or churches. But the 97% only service 9.2% of Black children in South Africa. Thus, education was also elitist. On the contrary, white education was left in the hands of the state and was very well funded. However, as Linda Chisholm observes, the role of the church also extended the education to the education of white children. While white teachers were trained mainly in towns and cities with strong Christian doctrine, Black teachers were trained in missionary colleges, largely in rural areas. The church not only played an instructional role in shaping the type of education that children received, it also mapped out the contours of progress, including the social and sexual well-being of people. During apartheid, then the nationalist government came into power in 1948. It sought to consolidate the position of cultural preservation that had already been established by the colonial powers and to entrench white supremacy through a policy that was called apartheid. We all be aware of this. Marxist historical scholars have remarked that apartheid was not only about the promotion of white supremacist ideals, it also was economic in nature, with the aim being the use of education to create a labor market for the white South African state. Black people were moved to economically deprived homelands, or what is referred to as Bantustans, where African development and African independence were meant to take place, as Linda Chisholm so well shows in her paper. And again, I'll make these readings available at later on after the presentation if colleagues are interested. Feminist scholars have also remarked that this project was also highly gendered, with the aim being the projection of white male dominance, not only just over Black people, but also over women. The apartheid state moved very quickly to consolidate its position. Black education was removed from the missionaries because they were deemed to be radicalizing African people, and it was placed in local communities with central government yielding significant control. Black children were to be prepared for their future social positions of subservience to the white people through inferior education known as Bantu education, while children were being trained for their future leadership positions in society. While children were taught Christian national education, while teachers were to be trained through what is called fundamental pedagogics. Both Christian national education and fundamental pedagogics reflected a political project that relied heavily on Calvinistic notions of Christianity and an equally unapologetic disposition in advancing white supremacist ideals. Interestingly, fundamental pedagogics has its direct roots in Europe through the work of a Dutch educator known as M.J. Langeveld. It was Langeveld's idea that it was Langeveld's ideas that were creatively reappropriated, that were diffused and reinterpreted to align with the local context. And you will see why this is important when I get to the issue of comprehensive sexuality education in the present day. For Black teachers and children, colleges, schools, and universities were located in the Bantustans, that served the purpose of instilling Christian values and that were controlled by the state, therefore reasserting white supremacy. Learners had to be controlled and made loyal subjects also to the newly formed Black elites who used the curriculum again to entrench their positions. Throughout this period, sexuality education was silenced by the powerful, deterministic, and omnipresent voice of religion and culture. The legal system also facilitated the silencing of racial, sexual, and gender diversity, locating the voices of women, queer individuals, people of color, and all those that were deemed to be different in the margins of social exclusion through a plethora of immorality laws. Consensual sexual relationships, for example, between individuals of different races were illegal. What then happens in post-apartheid? Recognizing the history of apartheid, the post-apartheid government has had a formidable and quite complex task. On the one hand, as Linda Chisholm and Crane Sudin argue, it has sought to undo the damages caused by apartheid while simultaneously reimagining what education in South Africa ought to look like. This has led to significant international borrowing of policy, often with disastrous consequences. And I would invite everyone to read Jonathan Jansen's work around this on outcomes-based education. Crane Sudin and Linda Chisholm also note that the South African government has had to grapple with both internal and external forces in its attempts to cleanse the country from its apartheid past and its apartheid policies. The external forces relate to pressures from globalization, the changed focus of aid agencies to development assistance, changes taking place in the world political environment, and the spilling over of new political ideas from the United States to and as well as Europe. And an attractive feature for South African and other African leaders has been this idea around the rights of the child, as advocated by multinational organizations such as UNICEF and UNESCO. And again, here, I want to be clear that I'm citing a lot of work that has been written, historical work that has been written by Linda Chisholm and Crane Sudin on this matter, who've done a stunning job in looking through the documents, archival documents, to engage with this. In terms of the internal pressures, the agency has been to undo the damage caused by Christian national education that I've spoken about, whilst also leading a new culture of teaching and learning reflective of the new democratic state. It is, I argue, at the intersection of both the external and internal pressures that the introduction of comprehensive sexuality education in South Africa has found contention. Through its very progressive constitution and a Bill of Rights that deliberately and explicitly recognizes the right to sexual orientation, South Africa has sought to cleanse the national image by distancing itself from the repressive apartheid state and its policy machinery. Education has thus been premised on the Bill of Rights, with all forms of discrimination outlawed. Placing a significant third layer of complexity have been the disproportionately high levels of gender-based violence, rampant HIV and AIDS transmission rates, and increasing levels of inequality. Given that schools are often microcosms of larger society, they have thus had to function under these highly complex terrains, with lingering effects of apartheid finding direct expression in the present day experience of learners and teachers. For instance, despite the very progressive policy provisions contained in the Constitution and other legislations in the country, there still remain significant inequalities between historically Black and historically white institutions. Historically white schools have remained highly resourced, offer quality education and pedagogies in which, as Linda Chisholm notes, rules and criteria are clear and they're explicit. Whilst in historically Black schools, they exist under resourced conditions, and offer mostly an inferior education and pedagogies that often emphasize on unclear and implicit rules. Further compounding the challenges is the rights-based disposition of the apartheid state, which has often had to contend with rigid ideas on religion, on culture, and on communality. I will return to this again towards the end. Daily interaction often reflects a nation whose apartheid historical ideologies of discrimination and the shunning of difference still find present-day expression. In 2019, the Department of Basic Education sought to introduce comprehensive sexuality education, supposedly following the introduction of the revised International Technical Guidance on Sexuality Education by UNESCO. The revisions sought to enhance the initial framework introduced in 2009 by providing a much more clearer definition on what is sexuality education, also responding deliberately and more directly on contextual issues, and integrating more aspects that relate to sexual orientation and gender diversity. Quite interestingly, scholars actually from Cambridge, I beg your pardon, from Oxford, were instrumental in working through the evidence basis for the revised framework. So what has comprehensive sexuality education in this section of my presentation, I wish to explore the South African national response to the government's attempt to elaborate on the already integrated comprehensive sexual education that existed through the introduction of lessons. Before I do this, allow me to digress just a bit to provide a background of what is meant by comprehensive sexual education for those who do not know, including the architectural design and the uptake of comprehensive sexual education internationally. Here, I seek to showcase the role that politics play in shaping local discourse and adoption of international policies at a local level. I suggest that the approaches, tools, and strategies often used by international policymakers have been strategically reinterpreted, reappropriated, reshaped, and diffused by conservative right-wing organizations with the aim of undermining progress and to force such international policies out of their targeted local context. What then is comprehensive sexual education? The primary concern of comprehensive sexuality education has been the provision of accurate and complete education as learners' physical, social, emotional development are concerned. The approach seeks to address child vulnerability, youth exploitation by ensuring that children receive a full education that not only sees them as social beings, but also recognizes their sexualities. And again, here I'm referring directly to the revised framework from UNESCO that was revised in 2018. The UNESCO revised framework defines comprehensive sexuality education as, and I quote, a curriculum-based process of teaching and learning about cognitive, emotional, physical, and social aspects of sexuality. It aims to equip children and young people with knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values that empower them to, amongst other things, realize their health, well-being, and dignity, develop respectful social and sexual relationships, consider how their choices affect their own well-being and that of others, and understand and ensure the protection of their rights throughout their life, close quote. Elements of comprehensive sexuality education include providing information that is scientifically accurate, incremental, age and developmental appropriate, curriculum-based, comprehensive, based on human rights approach, based on gender equality, culturally relevant and context appropriate, transformative, and able to develop life skills needed to support healthier choices. And these are the basis, the points, the tenets of CSE as espoused in the framework. While there has been significant uptake of the comprehensive sexuality education program across the world, there also has been significant pushback, both from progressive scholars as well as conservative actors. Progressive scholars who are largely located in Western countries have criticized comprehensive sexuality education for its shortcomings in sufficiently addressing the LGBTI issues, as well as its Western logic of liberalism, fueled often by American sexual and reproductive health politics. Such scholars have decried, and I quote, the implicit framing of CSE goals as reflective of universalistic neutral ideals. They've also critiqued, and I quote again, the underlying progressive secular promise as suggesting an othering of opposition to CSE work. And here I'm quoting Medema, Met, and Higgs' work that was done in 2020. Conservative organizations, on the other hand, have decried the state's encroachment in the areas that should be in the terrain of parents, families, and religious institutions. They've argued that the policy reflects an overreach by government and reflects an infringement on rights to religion. In the scripted lessons that were introduced in South Africa to support the implementation of comprehensive sexuality education, it was noted that the introduction was greeted with serious backlash from conservative, religious, and cultural bodies, from parents, from teachers and schools, in South Africa, including parental and family organizations. Many argued that the Department of Basic Education was trying to sexualize young people. A screaming headline in one of the country's most leading newspapers, the Sunday Times, suggested that grade 4s were going to learn about masturbation in the new life orientation curriculum. This resulted in a huge national outrage and serious public backlash on the lessons. The minister was called all manner of profanities, with suggestions that she was in fact trying to sexualize children. At the heart of the pushback was a narrative that government shouldn't enter the realm demarcated for parents, and that the curriculum was simply a reflection of feminists who are determined to embed their norms on poor, innocent children. A senior lecturer from the University of Stellenbosch, interestingly, one of the institutions that are key in the architecture of apartheid, remarked in one of the local newspapers, and I'm quoting her more directly, she notes that comprehensive sexuality education is indicative of a prescriptive state in terms of norms and values. And this move towards a more moralistic and intrusive state is informed by an ideology, namely radical feminism. The radical feminists, she notes, believe a moralistic and prescriptive state is what is needed to change culture and behavior so as to embody feminist norms. To affect these cultural and changes in society, this ideological approach calls for what she calls a prescriptive state and an intrusion of the public into the personal. And that was published in the Daily Maverick in 2019. Similar messages as that of this lecturer reverberated across the country. Parents in schools, right down to early childhood centers, were being sent messages, emails, SMSs, and asking them to sign petitions and to push back against a state that was trying to prey on innocent children. Central to the pushback were the rigid notions that I'd mentioned earlier of cultural and religious rights, and of course, that were mimicking apartheid logic. Protectionist ideas located in notions of childhood innocence were used to push back against the curriculum that was seen as a Western imposition devoid of any local context and experience. The government needed to be removed from power because they were not interested in the rights of children, shouted one of the conservative commentators on YouTube. Other conservative leaders took to media and also to YouTube to deliberately misrepresent the intents of comprehensive sexuality education by positioning themselves strategically as neutral. They noted that the government lacked an international legal mandate to implement CSE, and that there was a lack of evidence supporting CSE. Interestingly, they were citing very dubious studies that were suggesting that comprehensive sexuality education increases the sexual practices of young people instead of the contrary. Some of the arguments suggested that the content was not age appropriate, and that it was from the devil. They noted that comprehensive sexual education would lead to the destruction of children, that it was about the state's control of young people, that it was the radical left who wanted to sexualize children by making them gay and lesbian. Some were as outrageous as even to suggest that the government wanted young people to contract HIV and AIDS, to masturbate, and to introduce sexual norms that were evil through topics such as sexual stimulation, sexual pleasure, and sexual acts. I wish to suggest here that while these arguments may appear at cursory to have been uniquely South African, they in fact were not. Rather, they were a reflection of a global transnational mobility of international ideas, politics, and debates that have been advanced by right-wing US conservative organizations in opposition to comprehensive sexuality education. Here, I wish to turn to a video that was, I beg your pardon, I've gone too far. That I was going to share, but it's a bit too long, and I'm going to request Maya to share it with you. So thank you, Maya. So you can see it later after this conversation. A video from the US that was done a couple of years prior to the introduction. What you will see in the video is that, consistent with what I've just highlighted in the discourse that exists in South Africa, similar sentiments are shared by American actors and conservative individuals who want to challenge comprehensive sexuality because they argue it represents a leftist agenda of the Planned Parenthood Federation movement. And quite interestingly, they argue that it undermines parental consent. Very interestingly, the issue of consent has been used quite tactfully over the years by individuals who are committed to undermining gender-based violence, queer marginalization, and want to advocate for individuals' rights. But here, the language of parental consent gets adopted as if it is parents are being undermined, and the consent to allow children to learn CSE is being undermined, and their rights, therefore, being violated. They've argued that CSE is an attack on our children. They suggest that men must stand up and defend the children. And of course, this is linked to patriarchy. And you can see intonations, again, that link to patriarchy as established in formal church organization. And that governments that do not protect their children need to be removed. Clearly, I am suggesting the response is coordinated. It is, I suggest, an international affront, informed largely by conservative right-wing organizations and ideas from the US using local issues to advance, represent, and reposition such interests. The conservative organizations and actors appear to have borrowed the same techniques and tools used by progressive forces, tools of shared connections, of rights, of values, of globalization, of disenfranchisement, and of pain to advance their cause. I'm not suggesting here that local politics or issues or even actors are submerged by a seemingly all too powerful voice of international actors. To the contrary, I'm suggesting that international conservatism has remodeled, reshaped, and misrepresented itself in order to find expression and connection with local issues. In the same manner, that transnationally positioned CSE has sought to dialectically engage with the local context through mutual interconnections, conservatism borrows the same tactics. I'm suggesting that the pushbacks against CSE in South Africa are not exclusively a response from local actors, but rather reflect a transgression of physical and metaphorical borders by international, largely US conservative actors, with the aim of reclaiming lost ground in the space, a very contested space of sexual freedom and emancipation. It is then our task as comparative scholars to not only locate our work in the macro space of comparative analysis across multiple contexts and sites, but also to concern ourselves with how at the more micro, more granular levels of interaction, iteration, and dialectic engagement, local and international issues shape each other. To conclude, policy, practice, context, and history will always sit in tension with each other, especially in the context of international policy, globalization, neoliberalism, and modernity. As a comparative scholar, we know, or as comparative scholars, we know that the local experience is not always exclusively a one-dimensional representation of a pure culture or a local experience, but also reflects external influence. A multiplicity of voices and experiences are constitutive of the local and international policy contexts. Both the local and foreign shape each other. In our attempts to advance a more socially just, educational, political, social order globally, we should guard against a moralizing discourse that carries some universalistic application. CSE, I suggest, presents hope for many children across the globe. Progressive scholars, therefore, should aim to build alliances with the local communities and actors instead of imposing our ideas in a moralizing manner, as this creates new hegemonies and provides new spaces for conservatives to build an alliance with those we have marginalized or shunned through the process of policymaking and implementation. This actually works to undermine our intentions. Although the South African government has now sought to establish these new alliances, which have been very important after the CSE explosion, it is clear that significant damage has already been done to a very noble and just cause. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thabo. Thank you for offering such a very insightful analysis of a very important topic of